Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center. Welcome to this session on Rediscovering Multilateralism toward a Cooperative Approach to Middle East Reform. My name is Christian Ostermann. I direct the Center's European Studies program here, and been delighted to host for the past 2 days a very intense workshop involving 15 American, European, and Middle Eastern foreign policy experts who spent 2 days assessing, discussing Middle East, new multilateral approaches to Middle East reform. This kind of dialogue and workshop is very much at the heart of the Center's mission. Let me just say a few words about the Wilson Center for those of you who are not familiar with this institution, and perhaps also some of our online viewers. The Center was established in 1968 by an act of Congress. It's the nation's official living memorial to President Woodrow Wilson. It was founded to honor and build upon his legacy as a man who bridged the divide between scholarship and public policy. We bring together the thinkers and doers, the policymakers, scholars, and business leaders in the hope and belief that a frank and open dialogue will lead to better understanding, better cooperation, and public policy. Now, before I turn the floor over to Andrew Albertson, the Executive Director of the Project on Middle East Democracy, let me just say a few words of thanks and recognize our partners. Really, the driving organizations behind this workshop who have done most of the heavy lifting have been the Ebert Foundation, Friedrich Ebert Foundation here in Washington, and the Project Middle East Democracy. The Ebert Foundation, represented by Pierre Bungarten, and Knut Panknen, who's somewhere there he is. It's been phenomenal working with you, and I can say the same about Andrew and Tuka Nusrat, who's all the way in the back, who really conspired to organize this workshop. Let me also recognize Markus Quinlivan from Denkmodell in Berlin, the facilitator and moderator for much of the very intense discussion over the last couple of days. Let me also recognize the Center's Middle East program, directed by Khaleh Esfandiari, which has co-sponsored this session. And finally, let me also say a word of thanks to my staff, Tim McDonald in the back, and Kristina Terzieva and Elizabeth Zolotukina, who worked hard the last couple of days to make this workshop as smooth as possible. That's it for a brief introduction. I now turn over to Andrew for introductions of our speakers. It's been a terrific 2 days, and I think you're in store for a terrific panel. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. We really appreciate the Woodrow Wilson Center letting us be here and in such a wonderful space to have this dialogue, and that was a critical part of its success, I think. My name is Andrew Albertson, and I'm the Executive Director of the Project on Middle East Democracy. And we were delighted to be able to pull this together with the partnership of Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, this dialogue amongst some really outstanding and quite dynamic activists, bloggers, writers, journalists. The group really ran the gamut. The Project on Middle East Democracy is a small policy institute here in Washington dedicated to examining how genuine democracies can emerge in the Middle East and how the U.S. can best support that process. Central to our work is this process of dialogue, of bringing in stakeholders for important conversations that generate not just recommendations for policymakers, but also vehicles for continuing to advocate for the adoption of these recommendations, for continuing the conversation. I want to, as we just said, I want to thank Friedrich Ebert Stiftung for their partnership, the Woodrow Wilson Center, also Georgetown University for hosting our first workshop. This is a series of 2 workshops. I'll mention that a little bit more in a second, but one in May and one that we just completed, and they were our host and partner for the last one. The goal of this conference, as I said, was to bring together 15 outstanding leaders for a dialogue that might yield some outside-of-the-box recommendations for policymakers on an important topic. How, in an age of interdependence and interconnectedness, how can the U.S., Europe, and our Arab friends and allies coordinate and collaborate to a greater extent in encouraging political reform in the Middle East? I was heartened to hear in President Obama's address to the United Nations General Assembly last week, he called for a new era of engagement with the world that seeks a global response to global challenges. The President also reaffirmed America's commitment to supporting democracy. The United States, he said, will never waver in our efforts to stand up for the right of people everywhere to determine their own destiny. So I think this is an important moment, an important opportunity to ask in a new way this question of multilateral cooperation. To what extent are our interests and our values overlapping? To what extent do the existing mechanisms for multilateral cooperation offer us opportunities? To what extent is there need for new multilateral mechanisms? And where are there areas for improvement? We did not expect in bringing together these participants to find solutions to all of these challenges or to solve everything. Multilateral coordination, the coordination of foreign policy instruments of multiple states with multiple goals, each with their own perspectives and interests, constituencies, and traditions, is by definition quite difficult. Nonetheless, I think it's important, and progress towards this goal of greater coordination, towards the goal that we all share and care about, is quite possible. And I think it's exciting also at this moment in the U.S. policy discourse that there's quite a bit of openness to new thinking about multilateralism. And there's a moment of rethinking in Washington. We see at the State Department the Quadrennial Diplomacy and Development Review. We see the Presidential Study Directive asking all of the different agencies led by the NSC to coordinate in a review process on our development policies. And we also see in Congress a review of our foreign aid. So there are a lot of questions being asked, and there's an opportunity to push forward in this discussion also. As with a lot of our programming, in this case also, I think we start from the premise that closed-door dialogue among civil society leaders can yield valuable ideas and solutions that sometimes elude governments. So we went out and we found a really extraordinary group of participants, as I mentioned, all dynamic younger leaders, and then we locked them in a room until they came up with some great ideas. And we did that on 2 separate occasions. We didn't lock in the room, but we met, as I said, in May in Georgetown. And in that discussion, we tried to focus on areas of overlapping interests and overlapping values. In other words, what's the shared agenda for multilateral coordination? And in this session, we focused on the mechanisms, the existing mechanisms that for collaborating towards political reform in the Middle East. We also asked the question, are there mechanisms that could exist, that should exist, and came up with at least one, I think, great idea. This is our second public event, trying to review some of our findings, some of our experiences with you. We'll be discussing, I think, first, some of the particular mechanisms that we went over, that we discussed in the group. We will discuss, secondly, some of the overarching findings. And then third, we're going to discuss some of the convergences and divergences between the approaches of the representatives of each of the regions. We will look forward to inviting you all back for one final event when we complete our report at the end of the year, and we will ask for your help then to stimulate further discussion about worthwhile mechanisms for coordinating and advancing political reform in the Middle East. 2 final thank yous, and then I'll introduce our speakers. One is to Marcus Quinlivan, who was really an energetic force driving these discussions. Marcus was kind enough to come from Germany to help moderate these sessions. He came in May. He came back for this session in the last few days, and played an instrumental role in allowing us to all get to know each other, understand our perspectives, where we overlapped, where we disagreed. And then I think when we came back together in the second session to really drive towards some solutions because we'd gotten to know each other, because we'd laid that groundwork. And I think he really deserves a round of applause for his instrumental role in all this. The other round of applause that I think is very worthwhile is for the participants who all took a pretty significant time out of their schedules to be here to discuss these with us. We couldn't have done this without your volunteerism, without your input and your participation, and your incredibly compelling participation. So thank you all for contributing to this and making this a success. And I'll ask for another round of applause for these participants. Thank you. Now, let me move on and introduce our speakers. And as I said, we're going to go over those three different topics. First, Hanane Zelouani Idrissi is an assistant program officer with the Middle East and North Africa team at the National Endowment for Democracy in Washington, D.C., where her main responsibility is developing and coordinating programs with civil society organizations. Hanane is originally from Morocco and will be sharing a little bit from her perspective as one of the participants from the Middle East. She'll also be sharing on the specific mechanisms that we reviewed and some of the recommendations we came up with. Second, Audra Grant is a political scientist at the RAND Corporation specializing in Middle East politics and issues related to governance and reform, the dynamics of political Islam, U.S. foreign policy, and Muslim public opinion. She's a former intelligence analyst at the U.S. State Department, where she focused on political analysis and on implementing and analyzing public opinion research in the Middle East and North Africa. And as I mentioned, she's going to share with us some of our overarching findings and thematic findings. And third, we have Almut Moeller, who's an associate fellow at the Austrian Institute for European Security Policy and an analyst in the field of Euro-Mediterranean relations and European integration, based, although it says here in London, based now
in Berlin.
In
Berlin.
Recently moved. And I will. She holds an MA in political science from the Ludwig Maximilians Universität in Munich, Germany. And I will also add that Almut is now the author of an insider's publication on German politics and as it relates to foreign policy. So I'm thankfully a subscriber, and if any of you are interested, I'm sure you can ask Almut. But without any further ado, Hanane, would you like to lead us off?
Yes, thank you. First, I also like to thank POMED and Friedrich Ebert Stiftung organization and the Woodrow Wilson Center for organizing this panel and also the two-day workshops that gathered the 15 participants from the US, the Middle East, and Europe. And also, I'd like to thank you for your attendance today. During the last 2 days, as Andrew mentioned, as a group we had the opportunity to review and discuss some of the main multilateral and also non-multilateral initiatives that are introduced in the Middle East region to support reform. And namely, we looked at the UN Human Development Report, the broader MENA initiative, the Good Governance for Development initiative, and the European Neighborhood Policy, and MIPI. The UN Human Development Report is a local initiative done by. It's a report done by Arabs, and it started with the 2002 first publication. It is, as I mentioned, elaborated by Arab scholars and academics, and it sets the foundation for analysis of the region by countries and also puts forward recommendations for how to push for human development in the region. The Broader MENA Initiative, which was introduced in 2004 by the G8 under the U.S. presidency, which is mainly a government-to-government initiative. And the Good Governance for Development initiative. Actually, there is which is a local Arab initiative, but actually there is a little information about it. Most of the participants had a little information about it, and it's an initiative which was launched by the Arab government in 2005 in Jordan to look at mechanisms for good governance, and also the MIPI initiative, which was put forward by the U.S. State Department in 2002. I also like to mention that some of these initiatives are based on the Arab Development Human Report, especially when it comes to the programs that they elaborated. They were based on the Arab Development Human Report recommendations, especially when it comes to MIPI and the broader MENA initiatives. So these discussions and review about these initiatives in the region materialized in some recommendations in which the group stressed the importance of a number of points that I can summarize in the following. First of all, it's the importance of including civil society. Civil society is vital in bringing about reform, especially political reform in the region. It should be included in these initiatives. Also, strengthening multilateral approaches and ensuring coordination when it comes to bilateral initiatives. The third one is to ensure the continuity and sustainability for support. Unless there is continuity for this support, and also with mid-term and long-term planning, there is little impact to expect from these initiatives. And the final point is to create also incentives for government's participation and support for initiatives that can bring political reform in the region. And actually, this has brought a lot of debate, and that Audra is going to touch on. As I mentioned, these are just there are a couple of recommendations, but these are just a summary of the major ones. And also, I'd like to highlight that in addition to the suggested recommendation, there was the introduction of a new initiative that the group introduced, named as the Arab Social Forum, which is intended to be a civil society to civil society platform. So basically, this Arab Social Forum will be non-governmental, non-partisan, and open also to individuals, and will seek funding from NGOs, individuals, and private donors. And this initiative also translates one of the important recommendations that I mentioned earlier, that of the importance of including civil society in bringing reform in the region, because when looking at some of these initiatives that we discussed, we found that most of them are about technical support to governments with limited focus on civil society. Finally, I'd like to mention that while discussing all these issues and trying to come up with the recommendations, there were a lot of questions that we had to discuss thoroughly, and there were many divergence and many challenging questions, and I will leave it for Audra to talk about some of these questions.
Thank you, Hanane. Thank you. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us today. I think with any set of recommendations comes a set of trade-offs and questions about how to make them happen. And we certainly had our fair share during the workshop over the last couple of days. And a lot of our questions, or most of our questions, coalesced around a certain number of main themes that undoubtedly policymakers, academics, and other observers and stakeholders grapple with, as well as those others that might be interested in reform. And I think the first issue that generated a great deal of discussion and led to a number of questions was that of defining multilateralism. What does it mean? Our group's views tended to, during these debates, orient themselves around two key sets of actors, that of government and that of civil society. And of course, those who focused on government tended to be concerned with responsibilities of enforcement and the allocation of resources and power in a society, because if a government is indeed participating in a multilateral organization, governments need to be considered in any such arrangement. On the other side, however, we had a number of people who were primarily focused on the role of civil society, as Hanane mentioned. After all, civil society, they're affected by any decisions governments make in multilateral arrangements and institutions, and so it made sense to that group to include civil society. But that led to the question of, if you include civil society, is it still a multilateral organization, and how can it function effectively and efficiently in ways that meet the needs of civil society, but at the same time recognize the authority of government? And so it's not a question that we were able to answer, but this idea of what a multilateral organization is and what it should be seemed to be very, very relevant to us. And we imagine it's one that's also relevant to those involved in these debates as these organizations are structured. Another issue or theme that emerged during the debate was, what would be the trade-offs of avoiding touchy issues? Indeed, when you have multilateral institutions and you're dealing with issues of economic development and reform and political reform, those issues are very sensitive, especially the political issues. As Hanane mentioned, a lot of organizations or multilateral institutions deal with the economic, and the political priorities are often subsumed under the economic issues that tend to be the lower hanging fruit, if you will. In other words, those issues that are more easily resolved and dealt with and enforced at the societal level. And so we asked ourselves, is it constructive and does it make sense to avoid political reform and focus on economic reform if that is if those are the types of initiatives that are most likely to find traction among governments? And a number of members in our group did not rest easy with that kind of a mechanism. That is a mechanism that will focus on the economic reform. A number of members or our participants felt it was very important to focus on the political or include the political at the same time, as opposed to some kind of sequencing or not dealing with the political at all. And I think that that's a very valid concern. And so from that debate flowed an overarching question and dilemma, I think, that has plagued academics and policymakers and those interested in this issue for many, many decades. And that big question is, what are the trade-offs between political reform and economic reform? Do you need to have one occur first and then the other occur second? Is there some kind of sequencing that should take place? Do you need to have both at the same time? And if you do choose one over the other, what are the trade-offs? And is that something that should occur? We didn't come to any answers. I don't think the academic or intellectual community has come to any answers at all either. But there are some very important thoughts on this issue, and it's something that certainly dominated our conversations over the last couple of days, the trade-off between political reform and economic reform and vice versa. Having said that, whatever choices governments make, one has to consider how to enforce agreements. What sorts of incentives do multilateral organizations need to have in order to make governments, in order to encourage governments to enforce agreements? What sorts of incentives need to be present? How do you make sure that once agreements are made at the international level, they will trickle down and be enforced and implemented at the local level in ways that are meaningful and substantive? We came up with some incentives, and we will be willing to share those with you today if you have any questions about them. But again, these are questions that I'm sure others involved in these institutions grapple with as well. And a final theme that seemed to dominate around these debates about the recommendations was, once you have an agreement, how do you measure success, right? We all are aware of some of the programs and initiatives that have been implemented in the Middle East and North Africa. But in order for those to have continuity, and in order for them to be sustainable, and in order for them to be successful to a point where they're credible and continue, they need to be successful. How do you measure that? What sorts of instruments and variables are important? And how do the findings impact their support in phase 2? At the end of the day, quite literally, we were left with these themes. And one of our participants raised yet the biggest question of all, I think, the biggest question of the entire program. And it's a question or issue or theme that I think all of our debates and all of these questions have in common. And it is, how do you get authoritarian governments to be less authoritarian. That seemed to be what this was about at the end of the day, literally 3:30, 4 o'clock in the afternoon yesterday. How do you get authoritarian governments to be less authoritarian? Because in discussions of economic reform and political reform, it involves governments giving up some of their power. It involves a constraint or constraining of government power. It involves a diminishment of government power, a limitation on government authority, and in some cases, a challenge to government authority. How do you get governments to be less authoritarian, and what sort of incentives need to be in place to get governments to go along, or to convince or encourage governments to go along with these sorts of arrangements? Again, we didn't come up with any answers. I think we probably developed yet a set of more important questions, but nonetheless, we also developed, I think, a better appreciation and I think more empathy for what actors, for the sorts of debates that actors, whether they be governments or civil society, are engaged in when discussing multilateral issues and arrangements. So I think with that, I will turn it over to Anut, who's going to tell us a little bit about where we had convergence and divergence and convergence on some of these issues. Anut?
Thanks, Audra. Again, thank you very much for this process. And I think I want to come back to that a little bit, because I have never participated in an attempt to bring together for such a long time and twice representatives from the Middle East, from Europe and the US. And I believe it has been extremely valuable to sit and listen. And I tend to think that when we talk about multilateralism, it starts with that. It starts with listening to each other in a time that means transition for all of us. We have participants from the US that have the history of a previous administration in the Middle East and that are now looking at a new administration with new perspectives. We have participants from Europe. The European Union has a rather short history when it comes to foreign policy in the region, but nevertheless has developed over the years a number of initiatives. We had participants from the Middle East that were sort of recipients for most of the time of those initiatives, and that perhaps has always been part of the problem, that the relationship was not a balanced one at highest level, but it was rather regarded as sort of not a triangle with each partner being at the very same level, but as sort of grant givers and grant receivers. And I think it's important to underline that also we had different backgrounds amongst the participants. We were researchers, but we were also journalists and activists from the region that have a different agenda. And I think it's extremely important to underline that we really try to listen to each other and learn about each other's perceptions. And I think we should mention at this point language as well, because normally we tend to take for granted that we all, being invited to Washington, are able to articulate ourselves in the English language. But many participants in this workshop are not using this as their first language. So that, I think, does matter. It also means that some people that have things to say but don't manage the language are perhaps not part of this format. I just want to remind ourselves of that. We were very aware of these things when we were meeting and discussing, and we were sure that we wouldn't reinvent the wheel, but that we would try to understand a little better where we are at in this moment of transition. Converging points. Well, we were all critical towards the existing frameworks. We discussed them in depth, and I thought that was worthwhile. We could agree on that with regard to effectiveness and legitimacy. There have been problems. What that means in detail and for future frameworks has not been so much an area of convergence in my assessment, but more of divergence. I'll come back to that later. We also were very convinced that it is a very sensitive issue. The idea of supporting political/economic reform in the region is extremely sensitive. It means that we are looking at a region that is very diverse. we had a participant from Bahrain, we had a participant from Morocco, from Jordan, from Egypt. Even Europeans, interestingly, tend to look at the Middle East sort of as a monolithic entity sometimes, despite our proximity. Which I believe is interesting, and I think let me just add that as a European, I very much learned again that we have to learn indeed more about the diversity of the Middle East, of its societies, its economies, its political systems, so on and so forth. So we all agreed it is a difficult task. Nevertheless, we did not shy away from coming up with some sort of constructive thoughts. We all agreed, and Hanane mentioned it earlier on, that civil society is crucial and that we have to focus or refocus on how do we actually find ways of supporting civil society. And here I think I come to a point of divergence where, as Audra mentioned, we were discussing, well, which roles do we want to give to governments at all in this? Is it worth to make an attempt to include, with the experience that we have, to try to include governments in initiatives, sort of give them the opportunity to channel the kind of civil society they would want to see in such a process or not? And in my observation, we really disagreed on amongst the participants whether to give governments a role or not. Some were more looking at, well, let's try to really go beyond government circles. We mostly looked at government initiatives, but also we discussed what non-governmental initiatives might look like, and Hanane mentioned the Arab Social Forum as an idea. According to the sort of idea of a World Social Forum, a regional initiative. Another thing that we discussed, I mean, is basically, well, the D word as such, democracy. Which role does it play for us representing the different regions? And my feeling was that listening to our American hosts here, they said the D word is still around despite the legacy of the previous administration, but it's certainly not on top of the agenda at the moment. Listening to representatives or participants from Washington here, they said it's more security and stability. And I think we agreed amongst the European contingent that democracy and political change as such, changing sort of the governments and the regimes in the region, is also not a priority for the European Union. It has not been. The European Union is looking at the region more in terms of how can we make sure that these countries are able to look after their citizens, the well-being of their citizens, in order to avoid them, for example, coming over, trying to live in European countries. And we've seen that again during this summer, that well, they basically try to come over and they literally drown in the Mediterranean. So having said that, I felt there was a bit of a disappointment amongst Middle Eastern participants, saying we do need your support in that. We do need you to raise the issue of democracy and to help us in and protect us with sort of your pressure on our governments to to raise the issue ourselves and to have a momentum for democracy promotion. So democracy, which role democracy is going to play in future initiatives, was a more of a contentious issue than an issue of convergence. Eventually, multilateralism, and both Hanane and Audra talked about that. I'm coming from the European Union. That comprises at the moment 27 member states, as you know. So sometimes I think, well, we should not be too ambitious because we are already multilateral in this union, and we find it sometimes really, really difficult to get our act together. Hopefully we're going to get our act together now on the Lisbon Treaty, as the Irish are voting again today in the referendum. But I think we agreed on multilateralism is not something we should take as an idea, a value as such. It has to have a purpose, and sometimes it can just very basically mean to listen to each other and to come together and to inform each other about initiatives. And it can mean just very, very practical things. Learn about best practices, exchange information about interesting initiatives that one or the other country has become aware of, interesting individuals. So it does not always mean joint initiatives. And indeed, interestingly, some European participants were quite straightforward about that, saying, well, we do have our ambitions and interests in the region where sometimes we don't think we can work together so much with the United States because interests are just not shared to the extent that it would make sense to work together. So I think I can say that we are all kind of in a general spirit of welcoming multilateral approaches, but again, we would disagree a little bit on what that means then in practical terms. And just summing up, I mean, the idea of bringing us all together, I think, was a multilateral initiative as such, which was very valuable because we all go back to our countries and our institutions, surroundings, and we take that idea with us, and we're going to work on that in the group when we work on the report and the recommendations. So thanks very much again for that. I think I'll leave it with that for now. Thanks.
Great. I think we've discussed in quite broad terms a lot of what we discussed and what we found. I want to open this up for questions, but let me just ask one question myself first. We mentioned low-hanging fruit and the point that we're discussing lots of different multilateral frameworks, lots of different opportunities for re-engagement and new energy. Maybe I'll ask each of you if you have a particular suggestion for either the Obama administration or either an Arab or European government. What is the low-hanging fruit? What's the framework that they should use and put some new energy into, or something new is needed? And a second question attached to that is, where should the initiative come from? Is today a moment where things would be best to come from the U.S., from Europe, from the Arab world? If you can help us with that. Almut, would you mind starting?
Sure. Just one thought, but maybe it's better to ask Hanane about. My general feeling was that there was a wish and a need for the participants from the Middle East to have initiatives basically being driven by their civil societies and that are emerging and that are strong, that might want support from Western organizations, Western NGOs, but that are basically very happy and sort of also doing it on their own. And we were raising the question, well, does it make sense at all to have always this kind of missionary approach? And when it comes to the European Union, maybe I can mention a few things that we discussed, kind of practical issues. We agreed that the existing frameworks that you might be aware of, the European Neighbourhood Policy in its southern dimension and the Mediterranean Union, as it's called now, which is sort of the successor of the Barcelona process, they have a lot of shortcomings and sort of structural problems, but they allow, without major changes to the framework as such, for very practical cooperation. And we came up with a few ideas, which I think is just interesting to mention for the audience, to give you an idea. We discussed, for example, on the level of citizens to citizens initiative, the idea of European University for the Mediterranean. We're aware of initiatives pointing into that direction, but for now we don't have, let's say, a university in a Mediterranean European Union member country like Malta or Cyprus or Greece or Italy that hosts both students from the Mediterranean countries sort of bordering the Mediterranean and the Middle East and from the European Union, where curricula are both in English and in Arabic, where people really can meet and language barriers can be overcome. That would be something. This idea you can take to other areas as well, other levels of education. For example, when it comes to apprenticeship models in the field of technology transfer, environmental technologies that are being discussed at the moment, solar energy, for example, is a big issue at the moment, where the Europeans feel there is a good sort of ground for cooperation at highest level. Why not creating a school where Middle Easterners can learn about those technologies? Another thing I really want to mention, because we thought it was extremely interesting, was the idea of consumer protection lobbies that are very strong. It's a strong European policy, we were sort of discussing why not helping regional activists in setting up something like Watchdog, or we have a similar organization in Germany that has become very powerful. So we had a number of concrete plans for that as well. I'm talking too much already, I know. Just interrupt me when I do that.
No.
So,
okay, so then here we hear there are lots of low-hanging fruit, multilateralism. Audra, is there a particular point that you think, or a particular framework that deserves extra attention and energy, and where might that come from?
I was thinking more along the lines of timing when you asked about the timing issue. And that's also something that loomed large in the group as well. One of the things, I don't remember if I mentioned it or not, but there seemed to be convergence also along the lines of where the administration is in terms of its liberalization and democratization programs. But there are other issues, other international and foreign policy issues that seem to be of greater priority, that of Afghanistan and Pakistan, and Iran. But in terms of public opinion in the broader region, there also is this realization that these other priorities loom large. But at the same time, I think there's also a wait and see sentiment as well. And against that backdrop, an underlying sentiment of goodwill, because it is indeed a very different administration. So I think in some respects there is an expectation that things will be different, at least somewhat different. So in terms of timing, I think there is an opportunity to initiate some of these new initiatives. And I think one of the things in terms of the types of frameworks that we talked about, my group focused on BMENA. It's a government-to-government initiative that was primarily the brainchild of Western power or the United States, and Arab governments were not too happy about that. Yet, these policies or agreements that the BMENA program was supposed to affect were Arab populations and Arab governments. And so, one of the suggestions from some of the participants in the group was to include Arab governments in a multilateral framework, or a new multilateral framework of a reincarnated BMENA that would also drop the B from the MENA part. The consensus of the group was that it should be or might be a more effective organization if it indeed was more narrowly focused on the Middle East, North African region, instead of including Afghanistan and Pakistan, which are countries outside of the region. So those are some of the ideas and suggestions that we had. We didn't feel that it was something that should be jettisoned altogether, because it still served an important purpose. But nonetheless, there was some room for reform of this institution as well. So in terms of new frameworks, that was one suggestion that came out of the group as well.
Okay. Hanane?
In terms of timing, as Audra mentioned, but I like to take it from another angle, that of the timing in the Middle East, and specifically is the timing for civil society. I think now in the Middle East we have a mature civil society that is eager to take the challenge for the political reform, and the way we can help that is and to shy away from picking the low-hanging fruit is to support these, and I want to stress, independent civil society groups, in supporting them in what the actual work they are doing. Because if we look at some of these initiatives, there are some of them in which civil society is included, but in which way it is included, the support is for capacity building, for professional training skills and all. But I think capacity building programs are very important, but I think there are now groups that are ready to take the challenge, and they need support in their actual programs, in the actual they are doing in the field to push for the reform in the region.
Great. Well, let's turn it over for questions. Also, if any of the other participants have a comment or something they'd like to add that we haven't mentioned, we'd love to include this also. Yes, Gordon, sure. And we'll try to batch a couple questions together. If you could identify yourself and also we're waiting already, but wait for the mics to come. Thank you.
I'm Gordon Thompson. We're here today talking about multilateralism. Yet, I'm hearing, especially from Ms. Grant, a leap which I'm not sure is either necessary or desirable by talking several times, about multilateral organizations and multilateral institutions. Does this truly reflect the views of the panel? Is that really what you're looking at? And if so, why?
Do we want to take a couple more questions and we'll pull them together? Amin, yeah?
Amin Mahmoud, Alliance of Egyptian American. Regarding the democracy issue, we see that Obama administration really never talk about that or mention it, but never have the policy, and it seems the interest on stability more than anything in a speech from Hillary Clinton and so on. And that's really the old policy from Europe and the United States. Is last 60 years the same thing, dealing with the government which exists, and we never get anywhere. And that's really set back to the reformers and people who active in the area who asking for a change. Would like really to hear it out loud, talking about democracy and human rights. In the same time, you have a good relation with these regimes. I'd like to hear opinion of Audrey and Almut in that matter. Thank you.
Okay. I think there's a question right here in the middle. Great. Please go ahead.
Yeah, just a minute. Chia Chen, freelance correspondent. There are many challenges here. As I heard, you're going to have a three-stage. First, the formation of the problem and of the program, and then second, you talk about the agreement, and the third, talk about enforcement. Okay, in the first, I have heard is from both of you that the local government is not involved, and the second is this: you have agreement. Who agreement with whom? And from the first gentleman question is this: I think he mean the institution. What's the institution? Yeah, and Herman, you talk about this. Economy, politics. The two cannot separate. Just look at what we have, the financial crisis. Okay, that's the economy. But who come to take care of it is the government. Thank you.
Okay, why don't we give the panelists a chance to answer a few of these. I don't know if Hanane, if you would like to start and you can kind of respond to the bits you want.
Actually, there was a specific question for Audra.
Okay.
I think we had specific questions. Yes, I
For
think
each
the
of
first
you,
question, if I'm correct, and part of the third question is, were we? You said that you're asking if the perception of the entire workshop was whether or not we were dealing with multilateral institutions or organizations. I don't understand the.
The first, you really did not define the multilateralism.
I see. Yes, yeah. In the discussion, the question was, what is multilateral? What is multilateralism, and what sorts of actors should be involved in multilateral institutions and arrangements and agreements and these sorts of things? So I'm not sure that. I mean, I think it was the consensus of the panel in terms of how we conceptualized the problem. It was what was multilateralism? What does it mean, and what sorts of structures would fall under that rubric?
Maybe I have a follow-up on the multilateralism question. I mean, from a European perspective, we do consider, I mean, we decided to unite in a sort of European Union organization that, basically is expressing our wish and a general will to consult with our neighbors on the European continent on a number of major questions, and we work together in so many fields, including on Middle Eastern topics. And I described a little bit the existing frameworks, Mediterranean Union, neighborhood policy. I have a very personal opinion on the role that multilateralism can play. I tend to believe it's more, as you might have understood from my previous sort of interventions, that it is more about creating forums to listen to each other and learn to each other. And it always sounds a bit sort of, esoteric maybe even, but I'm very serious about that. I think there is a major benefit for the European Union that we have since 1995, a forum where Middle Easterners meet, and that means also representatives from the State of Israel meeting with Arab neighbors. I'm not saying it works perfectly well. There have been setbacks, ongoing setbacks, but this is what we have, and we know who the people are in the respective countries. Of course, representatives of governments, because this is the nature, and we were not romantic about that. This is the nature of government initiatives. Governments work with governments. What else can they do? They can only to an extent try to support other initiatives, which is why we also, and this would, I think, address a little bit your question, sort of the double standards. As I tried to explain to you, the governments in the European Union, I'm not representing any government, but listening to them, I understand, don't have the agenda to change and to put too much pressure on the governments in the region for political reform, because also there is a conviction that it's, well, basically none of our business, because it's clearly, I mean, in the hands, it will be seen as Western interference. So it's a fine line, as you know, and I think we should be really realistic about that. But personally, I want to say, and I'm not speaking for the sort of European contingent, I believe there is so much more potential for civil society engagement on the level of not involving governments, and we should be more confident about that. And we discussed it with some of the civil society representatives from the Middle East in our groups, that there is so much more room for improvement on that front. But I don't think we should mix the two arenas too much.
And I think that during the course of the workshop also we were dealing with kind of two different beasts. We were dealing with, in some cases, actual arrangements and organizations and initiatives, and then we were dealing with kind of multilateralist behaviors. And so I think one of the questions that this is why, who would be involved in these sorts of things, civil society, governments, both, was so dominant in the conversation. So it was kind of something that kind of flowed more organically during the workshop.
I just want to see if we can get quick responses to these last 2 points. Is it better to separate economic and political topics?
All right.
And then I think Amin was asking kind of, can we ignore governments? Can you skip past, and if we're talking forthrightly about democracy with non-democratic governments, is it appropriate or effective for mechanisms to shoot right past them? I mean, we mentioned a little bit the civil society to civil society mechanism, the importance of that, but any comments on those two?
It's also one of the difficult questions that we discussed during the workshop, and I think it has also to do with the interest of the government involved in these multilateral agreements or initiatives. Because if we go back to the European interest and to the U.S. interests, they differ at different levels and in different ways, and to what extent you can decide whether it's really a very tough question that we faced, and we didn't come up with any definite questions, but political and economic both are important. Personally, I see they go hand in hand. We cannot hold one waiting for the other to take place, and I think it's also the role of here comes the role of the Middle East government and civil society actors to determine what comes first in what context. And again, because we are talking about different countries in the region, it is true that the major priorities are more or less the same, but when it comes to how to approach them, in what way, what are the actors, it differs from one country to another.
Maybe just a quick intervention there. I think, if I remember correctly, we discussed the issue of political or relationship between political and economic reform under the heading of would Arabs rather want to live in Singapore, sort of not geographically speaking, but as a model as such, and that we simply did not have an agreement on where we would want to put the emphasis. It's a really personal decision of each participant, and we wouldn't come up with any recommendations that sort of would vote for one or the other. But
it was very difficult. That was one of the major debates, and that's why it emerged as a major theme. And we didn't actually. There's very, very little consensus about that. But yet we were still trying to figure out how to make these things work. And it seems that you have to think about, if you can do both. And we don't know. We don't have the answers. We just had some ideas, but no answers.
Okay. Take some more questions. I think there's a gentleman here and then one right behind him. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. My name is Mohammed Abdullah. I'm a human rights activist from Syria. I would love to refer to where initiative come from. I think it should be come from the civil society. We have the same situation in Syria. The initiative came from civil society and get supported by United States policy to promote democracy in the Middle East, and that's led the human rights activists and political activists to jail. That's what's happened. That's how it's happened to me, actually. I'm here political refugee after two times of jail, 2 periods of jail. About political and economic reform, it's impossible to do any reform without political reform. And let's give a very quick example. In economic reform, you cannot criticize the economic view of the government without freedom of expression, without freedom of the press. And that's what's happened when Professor Arif Dalila and Damascus Spring criticized the governmental plan for the economic reform, and that led him to prison again. About the question get from Amin, it's a very important question about the interest of United States and Union Europe, and they care about security and stability. And I will refer to State of Department Condoleezza Rice's speech in American University of Cairo in 2006, and she admitted that we support authoritarian government and dictatorial government for 60 years for security and stability, and we didn't get that result. And now we are going to support democracy and liberalism. And that's the result from liberalism or political reform in Middle East came. The United States and Union Europe scared that any kind of change going to lead and bring the Islamists to be in authorities in all the Arab countries. And they mentioned that in parliament in Egypt, there's more than 100 members of the Muslim Brotherhood in the parliament, and Hamas won the independent election.
Okay, these are important comments. I just want to get to the next person if we could.
Yeah,
okay.
Please. And the next thing...
if we could just hold the next thing and let another question. Okay. Thank you very much, though. Okay. Right behind, yeah.
Hello. My name is Matthew Lackenbach. I'm the Executive Director of the Middle East Peace Civic Forum. And we saw a niche for an entity that would bridge the gap between the civil society voices and the government. So we're actually doing that in-house. We see ourselves as connectors. Oftentimes governments see a conflict between participating in a process that they know might be effective while fearing that the views that are expressed in that process will be contrary to their stated positions on a given issue. So we work particularly in the Israeli-Palestinian process, and we see that there are a variety of views out there that are inconsistent with government positions, whether it's the local governments or international governments. So the question is, how do we encourage government to participate in a process where the views expressed are different from their own stated positions? Thank you.
Okay, and I think there are questions on this side that I'm missing. Oliver and the gentleman behind you.
I'm actually wondering if each of the panelists could give what they see as one positive aspect of each of these multilateral initiatives and one shortcoming, and maybe there's a lesson learned in that shortcoming for the future. And the other thing that I would encourage for these kinds of dialogues, if you're going to talk about initiatives that are conceived and implemented primarily by governments, that since they are closed-door meetings, that in some fashion you have the architects, the government architects or implementers of those initiatives participate in your deliberations, because they're the ones with the inside perspective, and in a closed door or off the record setting. Of course, think tanks in Washington do that type of thing all the time, and they would probably bring a valuable perspective to your deliberations.
Okay. Maybe a question right here. Did you hear one? Uh-huh.
My name's Erin Kelly. I'm a student at SAIS. I was hoping that you could elaborate on the incentives for governments to participate in these processes.
Okay, thank you. It's probably plenty for discussion. Yeah.
Should I?
Sure. Go ahead.
Should I?
Please go ahead.
Start
Almut.
with the initiatives. The initiative question, maybe briefly, or
No, that actually, I was going to throw it out to the members of the.
sure.
Yeah, I think I'd like to throw that out to the members and the participants in the workshops, because there were a lot of incentives, or several, I should say, that we talked about, and I think that gains a bit of traction. So can I toss it out to...
Any of you want to comment? Or prefer to leave it to the people who are up on the panel? Anyone brave enough? No? All right. Well, then it's left to the folks up here.
Well, yeah, again, it's one of those things where we went back and forth over how do you get government... Again, it goes to this question, how do you get governments to accept a limitation on power and giving actors the potential to challenge authority? And one of the things that we thought was important, and I'll just talk about this one that didn't seem to generate too much disagreement, was the ability of governments to take some kind of, or to at least assume some kind of credit for being involved in a positive process, and also a process that would generate positive outcomes, having credit international image in the international community. There might have been some others that might have been discussed across the other initiatives and potential incentives, but that was one that seemed to around which some kind of consensus emerged in the during the workshop. Anu, did you want to add?
When I left the first workshop in May, one of the questions that I asked myself is, how can we possibly sit and talk about reform without having any representative of a state structure that might be able to push that forward a little bit? And I asked myself, and I felt not very comfortable with that question, because I also knew that it is an extremely sensitive question, especially with all respect for the Middle Eastern participants that we had, and that did not represent their governments, but they were activists, and they have very difficult lives. And you were describing how yours looked. So I asked myself, well, I really was in a conflict, and I even sent out an email to the organizers about that. So it really kept me thinking. The solution kind of that we found was, well, we should really look at it on two levels. On the one hand, initiatives that engage governments, as we said. On the other hand, initiatives that only focus civil society. So my answer would be, if I look at what the European Union is doing at the moment, there has been a lot of criticism about the Union for the Mediterranean. Is it cheap talk? Is it just Sarkozy showing off some nice photos on a red carpet in Paris and that sort of thing? But on the other hand, it seems to me that there is a window for cooperation in very practical areas of economic reform. I mentioned the environmental technology, for example. There is a solar plan that has been launched, which is, from a German perspective, interesting. We have, a contribution to make at this point. Infrastructure projects are something else. So things that are more sort of in the technical arena and that are mutually beneficial. I think that could be a direction, an avenue for incentives. I like to come back to your question about what were sort of what pros and cons about the respective initiatives. Speaking for the European initiatives, neighborhood policy and Union for the Mediterranean, I'd say the positive aspect is that it was conceptualized in the mid-90s as a policy that has a long-term perspective and a broad agenda of economic, political, security cooperation. We have established certain frameworks that allow us now, despite all the shortcomings, that allow us now to sort of build on something. The problem, you can find many, many problems. In the area of civil society cooperation, which was part from the very beginning as an idea of these initiatives, I think a major problem was that the European Union was not very good at, identifying, or put it differently, the Europeans looked at civil society as they were familiar with. They looked at organizations that were sort of civil society organizations, European style. I'm not saying they did that because of bad will or they came from an evil point in this one, but they just had a lack of understanding of what civil society can mean in Middle Eastern societies. And to make it quite clear, that included, for example, religious movements. Islamic or Islamist movements were not on that list. And I think that was just a learning process that slowly sort of starting to be discussed. And which was one of the major shortcomings of the initiative so far. It's just a tiny example, but yeah, I think it's quite illustrating.
And I think from we talked two other initiatives that we talked about were the UNDP Arab Human Development Report, which Hanane mentioned, and a number of the participants were concerned about how the results of the report were articulated publicly, and there was a feeling that, at least from the Western side, some of the findings were misused, and other types of findings and priorities that were important for the Arab community and Arab civil society community and researchers were given less priority and weren't mentioned at all. So there was this kind of opportunistic or a misrepresentation of findings that were of concern for some of the members of the workshop. With the B-MENA initiative, I mentioned earlier that one of the shortcomings we felt was the overly broad perspective of the initiative. But at the same time, we didn't feel that it was something that should be jettisoned. In fact, it was useful, and so we felt that a more focused initiative might be something that would be comparatively more successful, and also might be one that should consult Arab governments, because that was also problematic during the initiation of this initiative. Going back to what Anut said about the incentive of technical cooperation, there seemed to be consensus around the importance and utility of having this kind of more micro or economic micro programs and technical programs and administrative sorts of reforms that are, again, less touchy, but that always brought us back to what about the political? What are we missing about the political? So it kind of brought us back full circle to this whole debate and dilemma about how do you have these sorts, an emphasis on the economic without sacrificing emphasis and the importance of the political. So, Hanane, did you want to add to that?
Yes, just continuing on the initiatives, I just like to just stress that while we were looking at these different initiatives, we looked at them in a very constructive way. We're looking really at what has worked and what are the areas for improvement. It was not a critique for the sake of critiques. So in the case, for example, for the MIPI initiative, we one of the good points about it is that it brings the issue of, it brings the dimension of the civil society in this area, though there are a lot of there is a lot of room for improvement. For example, when it comes to the way their partners are selected. Also, for example, when it comes to the issue of selecting the participants for the exchange programs, there is the tendency that there is the exclusion of the non-English speaking partners. etc. Also, the continuity of the funding, because there has been fluctuation in the funding. Sometimes there is earmarking for some countries, and this takes away the funding from other countries, and this creates the problem of how we make sure that initiatives and programs that were started in this country are being sustained, are being supported to reach some impact and results. And to come back to the issue of the incentives, it's of the incentives for these Arab regimes. It's really, as my other colleagues mentioned, it's really a very difficult question, because why should these regimes give up their authorities and their powers for what if they give up one power? Demands for others will come up. So why should they at all give up their and also there seems to be a little interest from the US and the European countries in talking about this reform, especially at the political level. It is not at the top agenda. So I really think that the burden will fall again on the local actors that have the interest in the political reform. It will actually, and it has to come from within, given this context. And in this sense, I cannot agree more with the gentleman and the role of civil society in the case of the Middle East. And in this context and in this situation, civil society has to play a vital role, and is in a position to play a vital role in this issue.
Maybe that's a nice place to close on them. We are going to run out of time now, but in answer to my question, where's the initiative going to come from? We'll have to listen a little bit more to local actors, perhaps.
Yes,
okay.
Definitely.
Well, thank you all for coming so much. I appreciate you participating in this, and I hope to see you again soon.